So I have some really good news for you. No charts, not a one. And thank you to RICS for the Coke Zero, man. I feel like a bit of a rock star. You know, Van Halen, when they used to go on tour, they had the no brown M&Ms thing. And the reason they actually wrote that into their contract was to see if anybody was paying attention. This is actually the first event I've ever done where I've said, possible to get a Coke Zero, and it's like, yeah, we got it. So cheers. So thank you for that great intro, Neil. Thank you so much for inviting me back for a second tour of duty with you, with an opportunity to talk about this very, very cool technology called blockchain. As Neil mentioned, I formerly headed up our applied innovation group at Thomson Reuters. And one of the cool things I got to do was, as Neil said, was to live into the future, was to look at these amazing technologies that were on the horizon and try to figure out how to make them relevant and impactful to our customers of the future. And the challenge, of course, is that, you know, when I used to work at Turner Broadcasting, we'd build some amazing things. We'd, you know, showcase news gathering delivered over the air from places like Iraq and the Middle East and all over the world. And I'd go in and I'd show something to the head of CNN's international bureau. And he'd look at it and he'd nod and he'd say, you have 2 weeks to put it on air. In 2 weeks, I can't even get a meeting up at Thomson Reuters, probably a lot like you. And a lot of our customers are like that. People that work in the legal space and financial services and tax and accounting, man, it's like pulling teeth to get new technology into place. But we live in an amazing time right now because technology is truly changing the way that we work. And in spite of the fact that we're not seeing it in the productivity numbers, as Michael mentioned, I can tell you it's real and it's happening. And this is why you see, and Amanda actually made a great point, when you have 70% of the world's wealth tied up in real estate, it's no wonder that you have this explosion going on right now in property tech. And one of the areas where that's really popping out is in this thing called blockchain. And I will tell you right now, hand on heart, this is the most hyped technology in the world. So just as to kind of get a little bit of a show of hands, how many people have heard of blockchain? That's good. Have you heard of Bitcoin? Excellent. How many people own Bitcoin? 2 people. Those are the people that'll be here in 2047 when the apocalypse happens and your money is completely worthless. So let's talk a little bit about blockchain and why I think it's kind of this amazingly cool tech that you should know about and why it's going to make a humongous impact on what happens in the world going forward. And I'll leave enough time in the end to answer a bunch of questions on this thing. So a few years ago, a guy named, or a girl, or an entity, or actually we don't know the person, by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a paper. And in this paper, Satoshi Nakamoto, male, female, legal entity, God knows who it was, we still don't know the identity, basically proposed this scheme for using cryptographic components to actually do peer-to-peer money exchanges. Now, why would this matter? Well, before we get into blockchain, it's actually important to understand and think about how our current financial relationship works with our banks today. So I bank with this very, very large bank based out of New York, and they have all the information on my checking and money market accounts. One bank, one ledger. All that information is there. And we have this thing called insurance against theft, right? So when somebody goes in and they hack my bank account and my funds are completely wiped out, I'm guaranteed to have that money replenished. It's a pain in the neck, but we can get it done. And that's kind of the thing about how money transfer works today. So we have this individual relationship with a bank. If somebody goes in, hacks our account, we got to go and deal with it. We get the money put back in place. Well, as it turns out, as Neil mentioned, so I lived in the UK for a number of years. I actually still have a UK bank account. And every so often, it's a bit fortuitous for me to be able to move money from my US account to a banking account I still hold over there. And if you've ever gone through the process of moving money overseas, you'll know it's one of the most bizarre, antiquated processes on the planet. I initiate this wire transfer, look at my watch, go fly halfway around the world. 3 days later, the money eventually shows up in my account in the UK. And why is that? Well, basically, there's a whole lot of scam and stuff going on with the way the banks work, let's be honest, because in this day and age of technology, that money, we ought to be able to zap it. And in fact, we can. We can do peer-to-peer payments and move money from A to B very quickly, yet that wire transfer process goes through, a change from dollars to pounds, it flies through the ether, it gets settled on the other side. God only knows why it takes so long. But that's kind of the situation that we've dealt with for such a long time, and we've accepted that as a mechanism for moving money and moving funds around the world. Well, the problem with this sort of technology goes back to what I was describing. When you have that single entity relationship with one other person like a bank, it's a really bad thing because we see the amount of identity theft that takes place. And you need no look further than last year in 2016, where through the first 3 quarters of the year, the IRS had paid out over $4 billion in fraudulent returns. So what happens is my money gets cleaned out, I'm completely wiped, I gotta start all over again. But imagine if instead we used a technology much like the way this room is laid out, where this table down here with Neil, the table with Sean, the table with Bill, the table with this lovely young lady sitting here, and the guy typing on his phone, everybody typing on their phones over there. Each of these individual tables actually came together to form a distributed ledger, meaning that not only did this big bank in New York have a copy of my record, but suppose a bank in California, a bank not in Illinois, we don't want the Illinois touching your money. Sorry, I live in St. Louis. I used to live in St. Louis. Don't boo me now. But imagine with a distributed ledger having a copy of my banking record cryptographically stored, hashed, something that you couldn't see, but stored in multiple places. That's what we call distributed ledger technology. That means that if somebody tried to come in and clean out my bank account over here, the other entities living on that distributed ledger would see, something's going on here. We haven't reached a 50% +1 consensus, therefore we're not going to allow the transaction to take place. So having a distributed ledger is a really, really cool mechanism of spreading out where the information lives so that if something does happen with one particular entity, the entire account doesn't get completely wiped out. Now, when we start to talk about blockchain, Neil, stand up for a second. All of you need to give Neil a round of applause right now. Trust me. So I'm picking on Neil, not you this time, Amanda. You can sit down now. So the reason Neil deserves your applause is this. I was actually going to have you form a human conga line to demonstrate blockchain. And Neil said, there's no way in hell this group is going to stand up, put their hands on each other's hips, and formulate what you want to do. But that's actually what happens with a blockchain. So back to that distributed ledger notion. So here's a whole bunch of tables that represent banks. Each of you have a cryptographically secured version of my account, where only my bank can decrypt it, but everybody else can see this hashed representation of what my account looks like. So blockchain actually started to come out with Bitcoin, back to that Satoshi Nakamoto paper that was written back in around 2008, 2009. And what they basically proposed was the following. When a transaction takes place from one entity to another, not only are we going to share the information across the network, but we're going to write it in a block, we're going to timestamp it, and it will be completely transparent for anyone to see. Transparent in the sense that you can't actually see what the transaction was, meaning did I move $1 to Neil or $10 to Neil or $1 million to Neil? But you can see a encrypted version of what that transaction looks like. And much like the song, Another Brick in the Wall from Pink Floyd, we're going to write that into a block. So hold that for a second. Now, in the next 10 minutes, we're going to have a whole bunch of peer-to-peer transactions take place. I'm sending money to Neil, Amanda's sending money to Sean, everybody's sending money to everybody. We go off and we watch these transactions as we take place. In the next 10 minutes, we produce a cryptographically encrypted version of all the transactions. We push it out to the network, we timestamp it, and we link the two together. So the previous block that was written and the next one, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that's what we call the blockchain. We're forming a big chain built on linked, time-stamped, encrypted records of transaction. So you could see how the conga line idea would have worked. Amanda could have been my first person. When the next set of transactions took place, then Neil comes in and they're linked together. Then Sean would have come in. We all would have had a great time, you know, doing the locomotion around the room or something like that. So why do we like blockchain so much? Well, the importance of blockchain is this. It does two things that are a humongous problem in most spaces around the world. One is that it creates transparency. And why is that transparency important? Well, we know in a number of places around the world, and we'll get very specific to property and real estate, let's just say that the ethics and the behaviors of governments and businesses aren't necessarily on the up and up. So let's say you're a farmer in a place like Brazil, and you've been tending your family farm for all these years, and suddenly somebody walks up to the government, from the government with a piece of paper and seizes your land. You have no record, you have nothing. You have absolutely nothing to prove that you own that land. And so what we're starting to see today are implementations of blockchain in the property space, where we bring together entities like the people involved in a transaction, the governments themselves, estate agents, et cetera, to not only define parcels of land, but to also define the transactions that take place as those parcels transfer from one person to another. We're actually involved in a project right now in Lagos, Nigeria, to tackle this very problem around mortgage collusion and fraud, which is taking place between government officials and banks. So that transparency is hugely important because we can see who's coming together as a part of the transaction. And we can create the second value of blockchain, which is the immutability. So here's the interesting thing about the way the blockchain works. As you add more and more blocks to the chain, the amount of computing power you would actually need to break the chain is nearly impossible to find. Well, it is impossible to find today because this block here, Amanda's block, and Neil's block are tied together. And Sean's block relies on Neil and Amanda. And Rich's block relies on Neil and Amanda and Sean. So what we actually do is we create a cryptographic tie between each of these blocks, which means what we would have to do to be able to fake the entire system is go back and rewrite some point within the wall and every other block that came after it. The computing power that it would take doesn't exist to do this. And that's why Bitcoin, which has been around since around 2008, 2009, has never actually been hacked. Nobody has been able to go in and disrupt that core technology. This is why we're very, very excited about this capability and what it can bring. Because fundamentally, a lot of what blockchain is doing, and this is how I ended up working in the digital identity space, is tied to the identity of things and of people. We want to be able to create transparent and immutable records for individuals, for things, and for companies. And that's fundamentally where the two of these will all come together. So here's a great example. Today, there are 1.5 billion people in the world who have no legal digital identity whatsoever. 1.5 billion people. The United Nations has a project called ID 2020, which is trying to secure some form of digital identity. How do we bring people into the world of property and real estate if we don't know who they are? And because companies are made up of people, there are millions and millions and millions of companies out there for which we don't know who they are. We don't know the people behind them. We don't know where they've incorporated. We don't know the taxes they paid. We know nothing about them. And so again, creating transparent and immutable records for individuals is really key to this. So one of the things that we think blockchain is going to do in this property space for all of us is to create that visibility behind the people conducting the transactions, behind the parcels and properties of land themselves, behind the government entities who are certifying that the land is represented, the tax agents who will be able to say this is what you charge for that piece of land, that piece of usage of a particular property, and bringing it all together in a way that it cannot be hacked. And that's an incredible, incredible value when we talk about the power of the blockchain. So that's where this whole thing all comes together. It's first thinking about the fact that we don't want to live in a world where databases live with one single entity, where those databases can be hacked, rewritten, disturbed. So we want to fix it first by distributing the information, distributed ledger technology, as we call it, and then secondly, bringing it into a blockchain where every single record that takes place is tied to a previous record. And you build up that chain, that history that is immutable, it cannot be hacked, it cannot be cracked, it cannot be rewritten. And once we do this, we'll create that transparency that we need for transactions all around the world. So where are we at today with this technology? So you're starting to finally see a lot of traction across the world. Everybody's sort of experimenting with it. There are 3 big consortiums in operation today to talk about. One is the R3 consortium, which is the bringing together about 80 banks, largely directed around financial services. They're looking at how to expedite that peer-to-peer finance exchange that takes place today because they see that their business is being disintermediated all around them. They're seeing people like Adam Bank in the UK set up without absolutely any brick and mortar visualization. There is no bank, it's all online. And so the R3 consortium is looking at how they apply blockchain around identity and transactions. Some might say largely to protect the existing model, but I would say to actually create better security. And you see great examples of why we might want to do that when SWIFT got hacked with the Bangladeshi file transfer of money of about $80 million. So R3 is one of them. The Hyperledger Foundation is a second group of individuals consisting of entities like IBM, JP Morgan, Intel, Thomson Reuters, and others. And it's a more broad-brushed organization that's looking at how to adopt blockchain for a variety of enterprise use cases. There's a third group called the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. We join that one too. We join everything these days. I mean, you almost have to in blockchain. And we call this sort of the adults in the room that are trying to apply a core technology baseline to, again, develop applications and services. Inside of Thomson Reuters, we've actually built some demonstrators. We created a project called Parcel that went in and grabbed a piece of land registry out of Colorado and started working on how do we actually trace transactions, bringing in government, bringing in estate agents to show that this could be done in a meaningful way. You have states like Vermont, Delaware, Hawaii, and Arizona, which all have state initiatives taking place around the use of blockchain. You have entities, like I mentioned, in Nigeria, Honduras, other places around the world that are looking at applying it specifically to issues around land registry. Because we do need to create that security, and we do need to remove that piece of corruption that can easily take place if we don't have that transparency of who the players are, what the entities and the parcels and the things we're talking about are actually defined as, and then storing them in such a way that's completely visible and completely unhackable. So with that, what I'd like to do is, I've got about 15 minutes left, is open up the floor to any questions you might have about blockchain. We'll talk about its relevance. Happy to talk about any other technology you're interested in, but it's a very, very exciting area to watch, and it's certainly something that we hope that a number of you will look at paying attention to, because it is going to impact the way transactions are completed in the future. Thank you again.